of all players in new programs. So if we know that as coaches, we've got to stop treating kids like they're mini adults, because they're not. And we got to create experiences for them, which they're going to remember their whole lives. And experiences that will make them want to always remain involved in basketball. And unfortunately, that's why I called it Transforming Basketball, based on transformational leadership. And we've got to get coaches seeing the value in this, because the more coaches understand that and the importance of it, the more we will see coaching behaviors in the basketball world change. And, just go on the Instagram page, like you said, look at that post we did punishing players. And, all the comments you see there, it's actually depressing to think that these adults are working with kids. And that's what I am on a crusade to change with everything I'm doing in the basketball.
You are listening to the Bridging Impact Podcast, transforming leaders on and off the court with host, Coach Furtado. Without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you today a pioneer in the basketball world, Alex Sarama. Alex is the Director of Player Development and an assistant coach for the Rip City Remix in Portland, Oregon. Gosh, I love Oregon. Great fit. And he is also the founder of Transforming Basketball. Transforming Basketball shares evidence-based team and player development ideas for basketball coaches, federations, and organizations around the world. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Alex.
Justin, thanks so much for having me on. Pleasure to be on the podcast, and I think it's going to be a great discussion today. I know you're really into all these ideas and a contemporary approach to coaching, so it'll be fun to take a deep dive into what this means.
Absolutely. So before we kind of dive into a lot of the wisdom and knowledge we're going to pass on to the coaches, I think it's really important to kind of give perspective on the impact of basketball had on your life in sports and how that has continued to carry and stay with you and give you purpose in wanting to spread and transform basketball.
Absolutely. So I grew up in the UK, just south of London. And it's really funny because when you typically think of the UK, England, you wouldn't think of basketball as a key sport. A lot of coaches would think of soccer, rugby, cricket, all the traditional English sports. But I think what was really interesting is growing up, because basketball at the time was not so popular, it made me even more passionate about the game. And when my friends were playing other sports and kind of looking down at me like, why are you playing basketball? It just made me even more attached to the game. And now it's actually quite ironic because basketball has become the second highest participation sport in the UK over the last 10 years, which is a huge difference to what I saw growing up as a team sport, that is. But I think what happened very early on was that I realized I would never be a high-level player. And I started coaching really young, at about 16 years old. And that really just provided me with an amazing opportunity to figure things out, learn through trial and error. And quite early on, I came across some different approaches to coaching, more based on using games to coach players. And that wasn't really a constraints-led approach, but more of a games-based approach to learning. And that's, for the coaches listening, instead of using drills, teaching techniques, a games-based approach is different, where we create activities, let them learn. Now, it's not the same as a constraints approach, and I think we'll get to the specifics as to why that is later on. But I think it was a very good way for me to start my coaching, because it meant I didn't have to do all the drills and the props that I started doing, the first year of my career really as a coach. And, ever since then, it's just been a lifelong kind of journey to keep learning. And now I'm very much focused on the research side. So really my expertise is looking at how can we as coaches incorporate the science from what we know of how the players learn best, how we can create really effective learning environments, and bring that into how we coach and how we practice.
That's great. And there's so many jumping off points we could go with. And with that, you kind of talked about learning from trial and error when you were an athlete. And I think, kind of we're about to get to some of the trial and error conversation. Can you talk about how that helped you become a better problem solver just in your daily life as a coach and just as a human being?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really funny because learning through trial and error, I think that's how coaches get better and it's how players get better. I think one of the biggest reasons that's kind of accelerated my development as a coach is really being very intentional about what works and what doesn't work in a practice. And I'd say I'm always experimenting, always trying something new. So I almost put it as a constraint upon myself, where every practice I try at least one new thing. And I think that's really important because as coaches, we often rely on what we're comfortable with. And I think, if coaches were suddenly to be thrown into the fire and just run a practice session right now without having time to prepare, they would do the same things they're comfortable with, the same things they've always done. I've even done that in instances where I'm not prepared. I just go in and I go to similar small-sided games I was comfortable with. So the whole idea is that instead, if we can really be intentional, if we can watch ourselves as coaches or trainers back and see how we're interacting with the players, see what we're doing in a practice, I think, like you said, that transfers to everything in life. And I think you're way more self-aware of everything you have going on around you, both on and off the court.
100%. And so with that, you kind of touch base a little bit on small-sided games, and I feel like there's been a new wave of what that is. And before we kind of talk about this new wave, can you talk about what traditional training and coaching is, and some of the conversation and dialogue in the basketball training world about, constraints-led approach and traditional training?
Absolutely.
Training.
So great question, Justin. So the traditional approach would be the coach is very much the instructor and the fountain of all knowledge. And that's how I started too. It's how we all started as coaches. It's just the way things have always been in not just basketball, but every sport. And the idea is that the players get better if the coach can express and, demonstrate the knowledge they have and impart it directly onto the players. So even though, there are a lot of trainers, which I wouldn't say are extremely traditional in the sense of the drills they're doing, maybe they're using training props or things which they're thinking creatively how to use props. But the thing is, it's still a traditional approach because the way that they view learning is linearized. So what I mean by that is they think that the more reps, the more technique training the players do, the better they supposedly become. And instead, my approach, the constraint-set approach, which isn't my idea, it comes from research professors all over the world who have actually looked at this stuff. It's a non-linear approach. And the idea is that players do not need to have mastered a move before they do it. And that, in fact, we don't even need to be teaching moves because every player is so unique, so different. So instead, it's really about, instead of being an instructor, being a learning designer. So appreciating that every player is very different and using these constraints to change the information that players pick up in their environment. So, for instance, a player would never move responding to a training prop in a game. They're removed to the information they're perceiving, the defenders, the teammates, the time and score. So it's all about creating these very small slices of the game which are very specific. So different one-on-ones, one-on-one plus ones, two-on-ones, where we have these different constraints. So that could be the time available, the space they have to play in, the type of defense used, how they're allowed to score. And the idea is, amidst all of this, players are learning in different ways and they're all moving differently. And we actually don't want every player to move the same way because of the fact that every player is so different. So that's really the whole essence of what this approach is. And it can be tough sometimes in a podcast to really go into it because it just goes so deep. But there's a lot of research. If coaches research skill acquisition or ecological dynamics, or even just go on my website, transformingbball.com, they will actually see some of the resources and the ideas which underpin this approach, Dustin.
100%. And that's something that I've been kind of learning and diving into because I trained myself. I had trainers that were the same way, right? We were repping things out on a cone. Yep. I was teaching, like I taught the way I learned, right? We're going to do the spin move 10 times at each,
Absolutely.
Wing, top, wing, corner. And so, with that, I kind of recognized and I started coming, I had TJL training Tyler Leclerc on around this time last year. Right. And so I was just kind of started to expand my mind and, I started to read some of the books that he had, kind of recommend and kind of talking about the movement. And I think one of the things that, I have seen, other different types of trainers as I've kind of started to adopt this philosophy, some of the pushback. What do you think some of the pushback has actually been when it comes to, the ecological dynamics training versus traditional?
Absolutely. I think we've got these very entrenched ideas as to what a good trainer or a coach looks like. And I think it's really hard because it takes someone very open-minded to say to myself, oh, what I've been doing the last 10, 15, 20 years, well, it's actually, there's a better way to coach. And that's what stops a lot of coaches doing this. And what happens, Justin, is they become so defensive that instead of being curious and even considering trying some of this, they just don't want to listen. And straight away, they look at any ways they can try and poke holes in the evidence and the research. And the thing, though, is it's impossible to do that because what they're not understanding is that the CLA, the constraints-led approach, it's the only evidence-based theoretical framework we have to make sense of movement, right? Because we know that as human beings, we are not computers. So what I mean by that is we don't have chips in our brains which store these techniques and patterns, right? We're not Terminators. And the problem is when you use that traditional approach, regardless of whether you're using props creatively or you're just repping moves 1-on-0 old school, it's still the traditional approach because you're assuming that players will somehow be able to store that technique or be able to use it more efficiently in the game. And there's just not a single piece of research produced by any human movement scientist suggesting that's the case. So it's impossible really to argue with the CLA because it's the only thing we have to understand how humans move. So that's what's so compelling behind it. And I think, as coaches, it's we've got a lot of celebrity trainers in the game who, are very famous on social media and, there's some really good stuff they share. And I think the problem though is that often they become seen as gurus, right? And coaches, instead of looking at the research or really being inquisitive as to if it works, they just believe in the guru instead of asking the question, is there a better way?
I like that. Is there a better way? And I found that that's helpful in all aspects, right? Not just training. That's helpful, for us running our own businesses. Is there a better way that we can communicate with our parents? And I think really looking at the research, right, and understanding the movement science. And I dropped out of human physiology because I didn't want to go towards the full science mode, but I knew,
Sure.
And so that was a little background on college, but then I kind of read this deep skill here in January from Coleman, and it's kind of just basic, movement science and just kind of the way he broke it down. It's just so interesting that I started watching the game just so much differently, right? Because every single person moves so uniquely. And so can you kind of dive into, for the coaches that are listening to this and the parents maybe even, how do we even begin with a constraints-led approach? What does that really even mean?
Absolutely. So the theory of human movement, there's a big word, ecological dynamics. And that's really the framework, the theory that underpins the constraint-led approach, the CLA, I'll call it. So it's abbreviated, a little easier to say. So really, firstly, understanding an ecological approach, I think there are two things which are really important to understand. The first thing is this idea of self-organization. So movement self-organized. So as human beings, anything we do in life, we are not consciously controlling movement. Right? So the biggest problem we see with the traditional approach is trainers, would go in and they'd coach how to do a movement. But the problem is players aren't thinking about how to move their body in the game. In fact, if we do that, the research shows that it leads to choking and worse performance because instead of being able to perceive the environment and what's in front of them, when players start really internally thinking, all right, I'm going to put my hand here, my elbow here, it disrupts performance. So in essence, movements naturally occur in any form of human life. So the idea is if we know that as coaches, how can we create opportunities for players to self-organize? And that could be as simple as a one-on-one where players have to finish against the help defender who's standing there. And what we're going to see is the players are all going to self-organize differently. As you said, every player is so different. Their anatomy, their individual constraints, their height, weight, wingspan. So what you're going to see in that task is a different finishing solution with every player and different solutions emerging every time. And that's what we want instead of coaching the same technique over and over again with minimal variability. So that's a key part of it. The second part from ecological dynamics is perception action coupling. And all this means, Justin, is that in life as human beings, we perceive and we do. And it's a continuous cycle until we die. And the biggest problem with the traditional approach is there's no real perception, action coupling. It's just action. Players aren't learning to couple their actions to real information. And players would never move in a game without perceiving something. So the problem is when you teach a move, like you said before we started recording the podcast, the players don't necessarily know the context of when to do that. And I've never met a coach who believes they have enough time. And instead of wasting time, doing this and then putting it back, trying to plug it back in later, which doesn't make sense, just have perception action coupling at the same time. And obviously how we do that is through the constraints-led approach, where we basically use these constraints, often seen as a negative restricting thing, right? And it's not just that. Constraints is just the best way to view them as information, right? We've got these different types of constraints which affect movement. So there could be things like the location of where a defender is, location of a teammate, the speed at which a player is going, the time and score, the fatigue level, the offense that they're running, any feedback given by the coach. So these are all constraints, right? The idea is that performance in basketball occurs with players having to act with these constraints always present. So the idea is if we use the CLA intentionally, in practice, how can we create activities where we're using these constraints and we're changing them? And what that's going to lead to is new skills always emerging within that context.
Right. So it's organizing these different small-sided games to work on perception, action. So perceptive.
That's it. Perception, action coupling will happen within those small-sided games. That's exactly it.
Right.
Like, just a really practical example for your listeners. Take a one-on-one, right? Now, if we just play a playground one-on-one where they check the ball, okay, it's all right, but it's probably not going to have much value, right? Because the players will be able to probably just fall on similar movement solutions that they've always used. So what we could do is just use constraints to destabilize those and get them exploring different ways to do it. So we could just say, you're going to play your one-on-one from a different location every time. So it's not just going to be at the top. Sometimes you might play in the corner, sometimes on the block. And we might change the start. So instead of the defender right in front, maybe we put them on the side. So there's an advantage. Maybe we say you only have 2 dribbles. Maybe we say you can only score inside the restricted area. I call it the smile. That's really going to change the offensive behaviors of the offensive player. Maybe we have a shot clock, 3 seconds. So the idea is we use constraints within these small-sided games to impact the learning. Because the problem is if we just play the small-sided game, it's just too general. It's too vague. But if we use constraints well, that's the game changer. Now we're using a CLA very specifically. And I've got, loads of constraints. And the idea is that we want to identify constraints based on what we see. So if we see players have problem areas, as coaches, we want to think, okay, how could we solve this with a new constraint? And that could just be the constraint could be changing the location of a defender. So a player might struggle with their left hand. So we put the defender always on the right side of the offensive player, right? So that's how we could use constraints.
That was actually going to be my next question is, the art of coaching, right? We're designing these games and we don't want to give feedback necessarily on every single rep. How do you utilize your kind of experience and wisdom? Because I feel like there is probably certainly a place for, hey, how about you try this? Consider trying this,
That's
right?
it.
Giving them an opportunity to go three to 5 reps, and maybe there's a number of reps we should be allowing, and then being like, hey, maybe try a floater. Hey, maybe try and jump stop and a bump or something a little bit more specific. So and I know that's the art of coaching, right? That's not necessarily a science because it's going to be different for every other athlete.
So just a really great point. I think this is what I'm getting at is good coaching is a mix between art and science. Okay. The problem with the traditional approach is it's just been art, and there hasn't been any evidence or science underpinning why coaches think a certain way. But, you can't just have science because at the end of the day, it's how you apply it. That's the art of this. So for me, it's like you said, feedback is a constraint. It's an informational constraint. So like you said, if you say try this or explore this, that's a great way to get players moving differently. And you could say something like, have you thought about doing this? Or I've noticed that you've used that spin finish a lot. Can you show us a different way to finish? So I think that's a great example of how the best CLA coaches in any sport, because I'm doing a lot of work now actually outside basketball in multiple sports, and trying to get coaches understand this in different sports. And what I say is that the best coaches are the ones who don't just sit back and let the game be the teacher, but they're actually really active, changing constraints every couple minutes, or like you said, going and giving feedback and just promoting exploration. I think the key difference is with the CLA, we're not saying that there's one way to perform a skill. So this is probably the biggest difference. Instead of saying, you must do this particular move, moves are just possibilities, right? They're not absolutes which must happen. And there's a much greater solution space for different movements as opposed to one movement that we're looking for over and over again. Like a floater, you could do a floater in infinite number of different ways. I'm big on developing floaters close to the rim, but I wouldn't teach specific moves. I'd be creating scenarios where players learn to float the ball up in loads of different ways and become more adaptive, because that's what a skilled player is. The most skilled players are the most adaptive players.
That was one of the biggest realizations I had when I was reading that book. And then I was like, it kind of clicked in me because I've been coaching and training for the last couple of years. And I've been seeing, some players are very hard workers, but they're kind of rigid, right? They can only solve the problems that they rep out over and over again because that's, traditionally what they've done. However, this kind of gives that added context and added perception, right? When you're able to perceive more, a defender's on my left hip, a defender's on my right hip, the defender is X amount of X height, right? And so you're kind of learning, when he's bigger, right, I'm going lower, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Justin. Yep.
Cool. And that makes a ton of sense. So now when we're kind of talking about it, you touched on it a little bit earlier, and I know your book that's coming out soon that we'll talk about towards the end of the podcast touches on this as well. We're talking about, I think this is one thing I want to grow this spring when I'm really training and developing players is how do I just kind of got into the small-sided games the past 8 months. How to, you kind of briefly touched on it, you talked about constraints, but let's say I want to focus on certain specific skills. How do I design a small-sided game to work on that skill for player A and B?
Absolutely. So the best analogy I use is we want to design a small-sided game where that scenario appears a good number of times, but it's not the only thing that's going to appear. So what we want is we want a little bit of surprise and a little bit of variability, because if players can, there's a good quote here from a coach in Catalonia, and he says, if a player can tell how they're going to behave before the repetition starts, it's a good activity for synchronized swimming and not for basketball, right? So that's exactly what we want. We want some level of unpredictability, because if they always know what they're going to do, it's not good for learning. And often, how that variability happens is using constraints, using live defenders. And I think the key thing is, at the beginning, if coaches want to shift towards using constraints-led approach, just get comfortable with using small-sided games and being able to describe them to players and have a bank of small-sided games which you can go to. But then the idea is, as quickly as possible, shift from a games-based approach to a constraints-led approach. And I think I'm really pleased now because there's a big emphasis on social media with trainers on games-based approaches. For me, though, I think some of them are too general and they're not specific enough. They're not CLA-like enough. And I think some people have confused, a games-based approach for the CLA. And I'm pleased because at least coaches are trying, but to really get the full benefit of this approach, we've got to use constraints. And the best way to do that, Justin, is if coaches are using the exact same small-sided game every time, then that's a games-based approach. If you have a similar small-sided game, but the rules are always different, then that's the CLA. And that could be as simple as changing the starting location every time, changing the rules within the game, the number of players involved, how they're meant to score, what the limitations of the defense are. And if the coaches can really attune to what their players are doing and how they're performing, then what they should do is create the constraints based on those. I call it a rate limiter. It's just a rate limiter is something preventing an individual player or the whole team from being more skillful. So the idea is, can we identify these rate limiters accurately and then be creative enough as coaches to think of what constraints would solve these rate limiters in a small-sided game? Boom, now you're really onto something.
Gotcha. And so to kind of continue to build on that with rate limiters, and you're talking about kind of changing it, like let's say we chose a 2-on-2 game, right, where you're on slot corner and it's a dribble handoff, right? Well, maybe it starts on the wing and then the dribble handoff, starts on the corner. And I know that you have another podcast episode also out about points, right? Because obviously, competition is a great way to basically encourage players to utilize something more. So can you talk a little bit more about how we can utilize points as also constraints?
Yeah, absolutely. So there might be one particular solution that we want the players to search for and focus on, and maybe they're really not seeing it. So maybe it's a pick and roll, and we really want them to focus on slipping out of the picks so they can get behind that switch defender and create an advantage. So we could just say any score for slip is worth double points. And something I'm a big fan of too is consequences. And this would just be, it's not a punishment, just a turnover, a loss of possession if something happens. So for instance, what I see a lot in pick and roll is players are not aware of the advantage that's posed by a really good screening angle. I call it a crack angle. When you come and you set a pick from underneath and you're I use the external cue. Imagine the defender's wearing a pair of Versace jeans. You want to pick that Versace jeans label, and that would be the crack angle. And what you see a lot of is players set the angle way too high. So if the defense switch, they just get right under and there's no advantage. So instead, I might do the opposite and just say, it's a turnover if you don't set the pick and roll at the crack angle. And that would be the consequence. And those things like that are really good for learning. And I mean, I have some really creative examples of constraints on my website, transformingb-ball.com. And for instance, we've got things like the wall. So what that means is the space that players have in a small-sided game. So we might be doing a pick and roll 2-on-2, but they can only play in between the lane lines. Right. So what that does, it creates realistic movements compared to if it was not constrained. Well, they could just go into all these spacings, which aren't going to be there in 5-on-5. I've got one, the floor is lava, where if the players catch the ball inside the mid-range, it's a turnover. So now we get really good spacing without having to say stand here. So I've got lots of examples like this of creative ways we can use these constraints. And often, you could use some of these constraints in any small-sided game.
I really like that. I'm going to have to go and take some. I really like the floor is lava. That's super helpful for spacing, right? We were kind of talking about I'm with high school boys, and spacing is, I've listened to a ton of podcasts at all levels. Spacing is like one of the number one components of what a good offense is. So I really like that game. And, one thing that I did see on the Transforming B-Ball Instagram that you kind of touched on it is about punishment. And I think it was kind of talking about how, not necessarily just making people run lines and do push-ups helps players learn. So I was just kind of curious if we could kind of dive further into how players can learn, obviously, to be a part of the culture, because I think correcting behavior will always be a part of being a teacher, mentor, and coach. Yep. So how do we do that in a more effective research-based way for them to actually learn?
Absolutely, Justin. Great question. So I think the big problem is coaches think that because I'm not using punishments, I'm not holding players accountable. And it could not be more wrong, because my players are held accountable to the highest of standards. The difference is I do that without yelling at them and without punishing them. And the difference, Justin? They respect me even more for it. And I have an amazing relationship with all my players because of that reason. And how I do that is a transformational approach to coaching. And there's a lot of research on this by a guy called Jean Cott. And the idea is that as coaches, we shouldn't be transactional leaders. And that's what using punishments is, where it's really, the coach is in a powerful position and dishing out these consequences, punishments galore. And, it's, I'm the master, you're going to do what I say because I'm the head coach. And unfortunately, as we saw on the comment section of that post, the vast majority of coaches still think that way. Now, a lot of us don't, because I think a lot of our coaches now are joining the CLA movement, and we're all part of this, and what I'm trying to share through transforming. But the key thing is, when we are making kids run for mistakes, number one, it doesn't make them solve that problem. It doesn't fix it, right? If anything, you're doing them a disservice, because instead of spending more time working on that thing, you're actually just wasting their practice time. And the thing is, too, a lot of coaches will do these things, but without actually having the players actually play live in decision-making situations. So what they'll often do is have some type of drill where there's 20 layups you got to get in a row, and if you don't do it, you run. And that has no correlation with becoming a skillful basketball player. It just doesn't. Things like a 3-man weave where you got to make 20 layups in a row, that does nothing. You'd almost be better sitting on the sofa and resting versus going to practice. And it's really funny because coaches think the punishments are the only tool, but really there's a lot of other tools we can have in our toolbox as coaches. And one of my favorite ones is just an athlete-led timeout, where if there's something going wrong in practice, I just say to the players, take 30 seconds in your teams, and I want you to have one specific solution leaving this timeout, which you're going to tell me. And what we're doing there is we're letting the players have a level of autonomy. And this kind of links into self-determination theory, which is some more research behind why this is important. And I think at the end of the day, whenever we make a player run, it's a lot of times players run so much in a practice that it's increasing injuries and it's not conducive for performance. And B, they need every single minute, every second in a practice, solving problems and actually taking part in activities which are going to be representative of basketball. And every time you're running or doing suicides, excessive push-ups, that doesn't happen. I think the big thing is, Justin, in my practice is, because we keep score in every four-sided game, just having a winner and a loser is enough, because the players learn to love competing, and losing is the feedback. They don't need to run for losing or making a mistake. And even things like a player giving a lack of effort, well, it's why is the player giving a lack of effort? As humans, we're not inherently more bad. And I like this idea of positive framing, seeing the best in every player. So I might just call the player aside and just say, hey, what's going on today? I've noticed that something doesn't feel right. And that would be a transformational approach. We're looking to assume the best in everyone instead of thinking that punishments solve problems, which they don't.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I definitely have adopted similar aspects to really giving that ownership back to the players. And because they are going to be problem solvers when they finish playing basketball, right? So I named my basketball program Beyond the Game Basketball, so we can help them be successful beyond the game. My I guess quick question would be, like, if players are late to your programming, how do you help them solve the problem of being on time?
Absolutely. So I think, my old school self would have been, oh, you're going to do push-ups, all this. But then it's like, especially, with some of the work I've done in London, the constraints that they have, often it's a parental issue, which they can't control. Maybe a parent's coming back from work late, or maybe they're coming from an hour and a half away to get to practice. So I'll take the positive framing approach, and I'll just speak to them after the practice. And instead of me immediately seeing them and saying, you're late, why are you late? I would say, Justin, it's so good to see you. So straight away, it's the complete opposite to starting practice on a negative note. And then if I've noticed it's something that's happened a couple of times, I might just say at the end of practice, look, Justin, every minute, it's so good having you here in the practice. Every minute here, you're getting better. And, I think if you're not missing the first 10, 15 minutes, it's going to be way more conducive to you and your development. What can we do to work together so that you're here on time? And just asking that question changes everything. Now, obviously, if you're in a pro team or college, it's different. You're going to have a different system. There are some clear team standards, things that, you want to implement. But I think especially at the youth level, it's a completely different context, and it's often the parents. It's not the kids.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And with that, I know one thing that really has helped, with me being and having high standards, is recognizing players that are giving that extra effort and like praising those players, because that's a way of, hey, this person, not that they're not, the others are not a part of the culture, but this is our standard, right? So just
That's it,
giving them
Justin.
that continued praise. Is there anything else that you could continue to elaborate on?
Yeah, absolutely. You just made me think, like, practice for me is so purposeful from the start that players want to be there. And what I see a lot in the traditional approach is the first 20, 30, 45 minutes of a practice is simply wasted time. Players do like ridiculous warm-ups, drills. Sometimes they go a whole practice without playing and they get to 5-on-5 at the end. And instead, from the very moment we start with the warm-up, we are playing basketball. We might, after a tag game at the beginning, we might go straight to 5-on-5. And very quickly, the players learn that we as the coaches are valuing their time. We're not wasting their time. They know that every minute of a practice is intentional. It's different. And that really changes. They start coming to practice early because they value what we are bringing to the table as coaches.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, because, traditionally it's like, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to stretch, we're going to do layup lines, we're going to do the 3-man weave or whatever we end up doing, right? That they feel like, isn't, I guess, as engaging. And I've kind of started doing the passing tag and, different things to kind of get them to have like a culture of joy. And I think that's one thing that I really want there to be a part of, BTG basketball and the high school teams that I coach is I want them to, after a long day of school and they got chores and they have family stuff going on, I want them basketball to be a source of joy for them.
I love that, Justin. You know the phrase I say, make practice the best part of their day. And any coach I work with, I always say that to them. And that's more important. Now, naturally, it comes hand in hand with using the CLA because it's more enjoyable when drills to the kids. But if you really have that goal to make practice the best part of the day, it changes how you coach. And that's, to me, what a good coach is. They're a transformational leader who, regardless of if kids, not many kids are going to end up playing professionally. It's like 0.2% of all players in youth programs. So if we know that as coaches, we've got to stop treating kids like they're mini adults because they're not. And we got to create experiences for them, which they're going to remember their whole lives. And experiences that will make them want to always remain involved in basketball. And unfortunately, that's why I called it transforming basketball, based on transformational leadership. And we've got to get coaches seeing the value in this, because the more coaches understand that and the importance of it, the more we will see coaching behaviors in the basketball world change. And, just go on the Instagram page, like you said, look at that post we did punishing players. And, all the comments you see there, it's actually depressing to think that these adults are working with kids. And that's what I am on a crusade to change with everything I'm doing in the basketball space.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense to me, and I'm glad that you had the time in your busy schedule to be able to come on and share your wisdom with the Bridging Impact community and myself, because selfishly, I learned so much on this podcast, as I'm sure you do on your podcast, and inviting people in and just learning and continue to be open-minded. I think that's one thing that I'm trying to teach my players. And I heard this great saying about a month ago, and it's probably way older than a month, but character is better caught than taught. And so I just really recognize that as a role model and as a transformational coach. That's something I have to live and breathe every single day. So I really appreciate our conversation. Where can people buy the book when it comes out? Can you give them the book date, and can they be subscribed to an email list to make sure that they don't forget?
Absolutely, Justin. So if they go to our website, transformbworld.com, or just our Instagram or Twitter, and they'll be able to click the link tree, the first link on there is a link to the wait list for the book. So coaches can get all the latest info on there. And the official release date is April the 9th. And it's going to come out on Amazon worldwide, a paperback version and a Kindle, and even an audiobook too. And really, it's just all, we're trying to really just change the way people think about basketball. And I think, it's always a pleasure to meet like-minded coaches like yourself, Justin. And I think the exciting thing is times are changing. And I hope that this book will be a catalyst for really accelerating that development and causing positive change within the basketball world.
Absolutely. Yeah, positive change is what we need. So I greatly appreciate your time. Everyone that's listening, go give go get on that email list and make sure that you get this book, because I will be waiting my turn in line to get it. And so I can have more small-sided games. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your time today, Alex.
My pleasure. Justin, thank you so much
for listening to this episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. We'd love it if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment and a review on whatever platform you're on. It's the best way to help us grow. We appreciate you for doing that. We'll shout you out on social media. I'd also love if you connected with me on social media. Let me know your thoughts. And this is why I do it. I want to share knowledge and wisdom from experienced leaders to people like yourself and myself, so we can have this dialogue and move forward, make an impact on the world. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. Cheers.